Thank you so much, Susan. Susan and I go way back. And also thank you to Erica Treppel for inviting me and everyone else here for coming this morning. I've had a great day so far of meeting with a lot of you, and I feel like this is a really welcoming audience for the kinds of ideas that I'm going to talk about today. So thank you again to all of you. So today's talk for me is a little bit different than what I usually do. I titled this about welcoming social and behavioral sciences to the table. I actually think that it's probably a better term would be a banquet, given that the funding environment right now for human genetics is pretty spectacular. And so who's been invited to that banquet, so to speak? I want to talk a little bit about that and why maybe it looks the way it does. And then I'm going to try to make an appeal and for considering that health disparities might be the optimal sort of opportunity nexus for us to do interdisciplinary research. And in fact, there may be, I shouldn't say there is actually a moral sort of obligation for us to be doing that. And at the end, I'll just very briefly sort of try to warm us up and for a little bit of discussion about what we might do. I think you all are positioned with such a terrific interdisciplinary group here that you could really be leaders in this field of trying to be a model for these kinds of interactions and collaborations. So the banquet, who's at the banquet? I think that first and foremost, and I don't think this is an exaggerated metaphor, genomics is really, the basic genetic science is really a major gorilla that is moving at an incredibly rapid pace, largely technology-driven, speed, lots of sequencing advances that are making things faster and cheaper, and that is not probably going to stop in the near future. I think the next group that are at that banquet is the sort of a group of sort of quantitative scientists, epidemiologists, data science, which kind of tends to be the new term now, and slowly, but more in specialty centers, clinical practitioners and clinical practice. And that really is often depicted as sort of the holy grail. That's where we're going to figure this all out. That's where precision medicine is going to be launched, and we're going to have these giant health impacts. I, as you just heard, represent sort of the social and behavioral science perspective, and I think there's sort of a sense of disenfranchisement here that we're really not in the genome science gorilla, and we're not really in the sort of heaven's gate for epidemiology and clinical practice. We're neither here nor there. And I think often when you talk to social and behavioral scientists who are hearing about RFAs and things that are really largely basic science and these other banquet members, that we also feel kind of like the group that's trying to sort of maybe get some scraps from the table. And so I think we want to think a little bit about why is that. So I think I've spent a lot of time in writing about sort of the historical progress of kind of the ELSI movement, the ethical, social, legal, social implications, which was really the police for the Human Genome Project, and how that influenced behavioral sciences sort of reputation in terms of basic genome science. And some of that has sort of made social and behavioral scientists sort of slow to engage. So it's not that somehow we've been victimized here, it's that we've actually, as a group, been slow to engage in this. And the reason for that, and you hear that in almost any supper conversation, is that there's a concern that this overemphasis on a reductionist sort of perspective on genetics is really going to eclipse our understandings and our focus on social determinants of health. And that these expensive applications that are so technologically driven are never going to be appropriate for public health settings. They're going to be too costly, and the public won't take them up. And then lastly, that there's lots of high-profile deans of schools of public health, for example, Sandro Galeo, have been very, very vocal about the fact that any of this new advancement is very unlikely to yield any kind of health promotion benefits. So you have this sort of reticence on the side of the social and behavioral scientists. Recently, I've become very involved in a systematic look at membership of the behavioral medicine national group, which is the largest behavioral science operation in the United States, a membership group, and have been doing a systematic look at why, how individuals in that, members of that group are feeling about genetics. And through online focus groups and such, we found out that there's also this feeling of, which I characterized earlier, of not being invited to the banquet. Difficult to find collaborators in epidemiology and clinical sciences, the sort of sense of we're not ready yet for that, lack of fun, and the behavioral and social scientists not knowing what's ready and what's not. Lack of funding incentives for social and behavioral science, the fact that we're often an afterthought, oh, we need to have this kind of a project in order to get our center grant or in order to get some other funding. So it's a kind of fire drill, and there's really not enough time to think that science through in a thoughtful way. And then that there's just really not many opportunities, and even in centers that really value this, cancer centers, for example, not much opportunity for these disciplines to come together to talk and strategize about what might be good research projects. So both kind of sides of this dilemma. So this is where I think the nexus for this, where all the sciences, and this is what I'm going to try to make a point for in the next few slides, all the sciences, disciplines, I guess, would say we get a win-win out of this, is that what matters to all of us, from basic science to translation, is disparities. And I'm going to just talk a little bit about why that trickle-down effect is really important at all levels. So when we think about health disparities, there's really a layering of these health disparities that begins at the science paradigm and goes all the way down to translation and health applications. So I would argue that the T1 to T5 sort of accepted pathway for science, where biology is all figured out at the bench, and then we go to highly controlled experiments to the bedside perhaps, and then to the trench, that sort of biases us to not think very much about translation for a very long time in the unfolding of the science. And that the knowledge base then gets affected by that because we often underrepresent diversity in our studies, and that leads to us inadequately characterizing, say, gene-disease associations. That in turn translates into health applications that maybe will have poor reach because we haven't been concerned with reach at the beginning of the research process, and that we also will see differential health benefits because the science base on which our health applications are made don't fit some of the target audiences that could benefit most from their interventions. So we have this cascade of influences that affects all of our disciplines. So let's just talk about basic science for a minute, where GWAS, gene disease associations, large studies of SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, which are just a difference in the string of letters on the genome that indicate different sort of risk levels. And in 900 data sets of these studies, we find that there are in 108 GWAS associations that these studies are largely done on European populations. And that when we look across the ancestry groups from European, African, and Asian, we see very modest correlations of the size, about 0.2 to 0.3, across those populations in gene disease associations. And the effect sizes of those associations vary, particularly when we compare African ancestry groups to either European or Asian. And what we see is that some of them are in the opposite direction. So for some people, for some ancestry groups, that gene disease association is protective, and for others, it's a risk factor. And we also see that even when they're in the same direction, that they can be twofold in difference. So there's a large sort of variability across these ancestry groups. And we can anticipate this, and yet we really don't have an adequate evidence base to cover these other ancestry groups. Likewise, in terms of how that trickles down to disparities in applications, we see in terms of genetic testing, which is really the front line, particularly in hereditary cancers, we see that our risk models then become inadequate. So, and many of the risk models for hereditary breast cancer, for example, and for HNPCC have been in white populations. So our understanding of testing benefits then are really based on white populations, and largely for BRCA, Ashkenazi Jewish populations. So when we start to estimate the population prevalence, what we find is in African American populations, though this is getting a little bit better, that those that are tested for BRCA mutations, for example, are much more likely to be found to have variants of unknown significance. Well, a variant of unknown significance to an individual African-American woman might not be a very advantageous outcome for her to have, or that knowledge for her to have. So the applications have differential benefit. So this is, I think, an important point point in the talk to sort of make the distinction between disparities and differences, because I think that not all differences are disparities, and I think we have to keep that mindset as we move through these research protocols. So what I was just talking about in terms of clinical appropriateness, so an African-American woman, if she's fully informed of what a BRCA test is going to tell her, deciding that having a high risk of a variant of unknown significance and it not being a very informative test and declining that test is not necessarily a disparity. It maybe derives from disparities around the scientific evidence base that's been put forward, but it isn't a disparity unto itself. The disparities, by contrast, are those that are really structural limits to access to care, providers that have biased perspectives and don't fairly distribute resources that could benefit patients. So those are distinctly different, and we have to honor both of those as we go in terms of how we interpret the scientific findings, and you'll see that a little bit more as I move forward. So I'm going to talk about examples of disparities in terms of how this research, its cascade goes. I'm going to focus a lot for the science paradigm and the knowledge base, because again, I think it's where we could be collaborating much more on research recruitment to get this evidence knowledge base to be more representative. And then I'm going to focus a lot on cancer this morning, because I think, honestly, that is where the front line is, but I do believe that these could be there are other kinds of diseases that are coming along as well, hypercholesterolemia and things like that are also coming along that will have big public health implications. Or public health research questions. And then, so there you go. So this study started in 1998, the Cancer Genetics Network. I was at Duke at the time, and Duke was one of the sites that was funded. The Cancer Genetics Network was one of the first studies to look at gene-disease associations, and they had 8 centers that they thoughtfully situated around the United States, and you can see that they situated them in areas of density where there were different racial ethnic populations, with the idea that this would, if we build it, they will come. And in 2002, which was 4 years later, there was a commentary that came out by Deb Bowen, and here it says, as of May 2002, the Cancer Genetics Network contained 15,000 participants, 240,000 family members, and the majority of these participants were non-Hispanic, white, Caucasian, 90%. And these participation figures did not match those of the general population or public, nor did they match the catchment areas of the participating sites in the CGM. So that really prompted some introspection. In 2002, there was a group that sort of looked and analyzed what was going on in preparation to do some more ambitious kinds of minority recruitment. And so the group at Duke looked at the Duke site data, and here you see, I think it points out something very, very interesting about this difference disparity kind of issue. So what you see is a difference in uptake among blacks. 37% entered the CGN versus 58% of whites. But how this breaks out in terms of the process through making the decision to take up the CGN network, and these were mostly women with breast cancer, or men too with breast cancer, but largely women, was that 46% of the black participants received the materials and declined. So we reached them, technically. They read over the materials, made some assessment that this was not an appropriate thing for them to do or not something they wanted to do, versus 28% of the whites. There was no difference in the people who just declined outright. So the difference here in terms of uptake was really that the African Americans in this sample rejected the study. It wasn't that we didn't reach them. Is that a disparity or is that a difference? I think we don't fully know. But that prompted a lot of more introspection around what could we be doing. And I think, again, behavioral scientists were not involved in this, because I was at Duke. I waved my hand and said, I'll help. And what happened is that they made brochures with African American faces and Hispanic faces on them, and they boosted the participation rates a little bit. But it was 2008, it was 10 years later, This study had been in the field for 10 years with inadequate minority recruitment. So keep that in mind. So then in 2006, I was at the National Human Genome Research Institute, and we had this rumbling that the companies like 23andMe were coming along, that there was going to be these new, what they were calling multiplex tests, which were really a collection of these single nucleotide polymorphisms that were associated with common diseases like hypertension and hypercholesterol and cancer, diabetes, those sorts of things. Common cancers, not rare cancers. And so we just developed our own test, the multiplex test, and to see what the uptake of this would be. If we told individuals what this was really going to tell them in terms of, very modest increases in risk and so forth, would they want that test? And we wanted to make sure we had a representative sample. We wanted to remove all the barriers, which the CGN did not, all the barriers to participation. So no cost, all electronic, the first time to do telephone counseling for genetics, and consenting and so forth. And we did this at Henry Ford Health System in Detroit. So these were all enrollees of Henry Ford. And Shazam, what we found was, again, same thing. African Americans were significantly less likely to complete the baseline survey, significantly less likely to visit the website and decide whether or not this test made sense to them, and then significantly less likely to be tested or to accept the testing. Now, I've made the argument on several occasions that this was actually African Americans being better consumers of these tests than white Americans, in the sense that these tests, we were very forthright in saying these tests aren't going to tell you much of anything. But you can still see the cascade that that there was taking themselves out earlier in the game, and that we weren't able, by virtue of what we designed, to really get inside of that and what was going on there. So now we have all of us recruitment. Brand new, launched May 6th, very ambitious goals to recruit Americans that have not been represented in research to date, in genetic research to date. This is their website, and I think you're going to see something that looks very familiar. If we build it, they will come approach. Centers all over, different kinds of centers, recruitment centers, where they want to have individuals enrolled who have access to electronic health records. And I'm struck by wanting to make a slightly catty comment, and I'm sorry, I apologize to all of you who are All of Us fans, is that, Einstein said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing and expecting a different outcome. And I hesitate to guess that 10 years from now, 2028, we'll be looking at why didn't we get more minorities represented in this study? And again, I would say there's absolutely been no science from social and behavioral scientists about how this might be fostered. So I want to turn now to health applications, and here I start to move more into the cancer area. And I think most of you are familiar that really genetic testing is probably the most sort of ready, available clinical tool that also has population implications. And I'm going to talk about genetic testing for hereditary breast and ovarian cancer just as an example. It certainly can apply to other diseases. But we know most of us have heard about BRCA testing, but the science is moving fairly fast. And as I pointed out about African Americans having these variants of unknown significance, that we're actually closing in a bit on that and finding other variants that might be explaining some of that. So we have the TP53, which also confers a fair amount of risk. And we now have these profiles of tests that can test for all of those. And we also, for what we think from public health standpoint, is that if we're going to do this kind of testing, then there needs to be some health benefits that we can identify. And here you can see we can enhance our screening frequency. We can do risk-reducing surgery, though that's fairly dramatic. Prophylactic mastectomy and oophorectomy. There are chemoprevention that are sort of long-term chemopreventions in the form of tamoxifen or other oral contraceptives. And really the big push for this is, as well, is that it doesn't just benefit an individual that gets tested, it has implications for their entire family, which is also another area of sort of great potential benefit. Most of the way that this is being done currently is through identifying patients who have breast cancer through tumor registries that are often located in cancer centers or state registries, and those, at least in the cancer centers, tend to overrepresent white, high SES women. And then there's also been some efforts to increase reach, but very few have done anything with the community. But most of this has been around telegenetics. So the idea that we don't have enough genetic counselors, so what we'll do is we'll provide telephone counseling so people don't have to move across large geographic bases to get these services, and also video conferencing and so forth. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the experiences of some of those efforts. So this is a study that was a multi-site study done at Georgetown, up northeast areas, where patients were that looked like they were good candidates. There's quite a few clinical parameters in terms of the amount of breast cancer in the family and so forth, that they were either self-referred based on a self-screening or physician-referred for about a 7-year time period. And those individuals were randomized to either receive telephone counseling or face-to-face genetic counseling. You can see here just over 600 participants. Very few of those participants were non-white, and this was, again, another site that was based in Washington, D.C. with the goal of recruiting minority participants, but it was done through a specialty cancer center. And what you can see here is that whites were 2 times more likely to undergo the genetic testing, even though these individuals would have been deemed to be appropriate for genetic testing. So this is a declining, probably what a clinician would consider inappropriate declining. Similarly, there was one of the sites was in New Mexico that was again selected to recruit Hispanic Americans. And what they found there was even in Albuquerque, New Mexico, they only recruited 5.8% that were Hispanic. And they had very similar, it was actually the sample size was too small to look at this kind of a comparison. But what's also very interesting is how they responded, whites and African Americans responded to these different treatment arms. So overall, the conclusion of the trial was this was non-inferior. So telephone counseling was non-inferior to face-to-face counseling. Except when you look at the minority breakout, what you see very clearly is that African Americans responded worse to telephone counseling than face-to-face counseling. So if you consider uptake of genetic testing, so they've reached the point where they should be considering genetic testing, and we know that African Americans tend to have more virulent breast cancers, that you can see here they did not respond the same to, they were less benefited, you would argue, by the telephone counseling. And so again, difference or disparity probably again cascades in that conclusion. Next, I'm going to talk about actual treatment, chemo prevention, and the sort of same kinds of issues that you see in terms of disparities around chemo prevention. So there's a tumor test that's called the 21 gene recurrence, can predict whether or not women who've had breast cancer are at a low, intermediate, or high risk for recurrence. And then those who are most likely to benefit from chemo, and chemo has significant side effects and quality of life diminishment, that those who who are in the high risk category, it's very unambiguous that they should get chemotherapy. Those who are in the low risk category, it's unambiguous that they should get not probably benefit from chemotherapy. And the intermediate group, there's more of a decision process. And what you see here is in the National Cancer Database for 8-year time frame, 143,000 patients. What's notable is that only 54% of those patients had the assay ordered for them, so there's still a big gap in terms of just getting providers to actually order the test, though there is lots of dispute about whether that's getting better or not. But that whites were consistently more likely to get the 21 gene testing than blacks or any other minority group, and that younger black women were significantly more likely to receive chemo regardless of testing or recurrence risk level. So a sense that there isn't being the same clinical sort of considerations that are being given. And this is at the provider level, so we're introducing that level of potential bias and perhaps disparity. We also see, which is really chilling, is that in Georgia, where there's 2,000 cases between 2005 and 2009, large proportion African American, 54%. What we see here is that African American women are a half as likely to be tested, but twice as likely to be in the high risk category. So again, the sense of that there's sort of a layering of disparities. So now I want to turn to just talk a little bit about portals for collaboration, areas where I think, and again, focusing on research and health applications. So I think there's a whole bunch of stuff here, and I think a lot of it comes down to communication, different levels of communication, that they're all communication challenges. What do communities of color have to gain from research participation around genetics, and what is lost to them both individually and as a population if these trends continue? There's also issues around comprehension of what this testing means, both from a decision standpoint, how to decide if you want to do these things or not, and then in whether or not they engage in appropriate follow-up. There's sort of decision support for those in that intermediate group, and for those at high risk, but maybe the knowledge base isn't where it needs to be. There's provider self-awareness of bias. There's family communication and the flow of family communication so that the testing of the individuals can also benefit the larger network. And then there's just these ongoing sort of like chronic disease kinds of questions about how to promote and sustain adherence to chemo prevention. So I'm going to just hit on, not all of these for sure, just touch on a few little areas where I say there's really a dearth of research. So I think the big issue here is that most of what the public understands about genetics is that not at the G by E level. Oops, sorry, I lost something here. Sorry. Well, I lost a figure here. But basically the bullet points tell you that most of the public understand think of genes and environment as parallel track. And they tend to think of it, there's not really a sense of their, overall, when they think about what causes, this is about heart disease and cancer, what are the causes for heart disease and cancer? They think those causes are behavioral, separate, genetic, separate. They don't really talk at all about social structural factors, which is remarkable given their big bang in disease causation. And most of this is because the knowledge base is moving so fast, the general public can't keep up with it. Most of us as scientists can't keep up with it. And that most of that knowledge base is really back in the Mendelian kind of world. And that if we're really going to engage these populations, particularly minority populations, my argument is that they have to understand that this is G by E. And that what we're going to learn is really going to help us address what are social determinants of health in a different way. So we set about doing this in a pilot study after we had had another trial of looking at lung cancer families and finding that we were having poor minority recruitment, and realized actually we actually didn't recruit African Americans because we didn't feel like we focused solely on whites and Hispanics because we didn't feel like our messages were appropriate, and so and that the evidence base was appropriate. So we then decided to do a pilot study with African American families. So these were individuals where the, so to speak, proband had lung cancer and lung cancer has high fatality rate. And we were asking the lung cancer patient to enumerate his or her family members who were cigarette smokers. And then we were going to them and we were trying to understand what would motivate them to participate in genetic research and genetic testing. And so what we did is we did a survey where we talked to them about the disparities in lung cancer. So that African American smokers smoke fewer cigarettes than whites, but they're more likely to get lung cancer. And we asked them what do they think explains these differences. And then we gave them 4 narratives. And the 4 narratives were explanations that are science-based explanations for why these differences might be. Genetic differences that make them more susceptible to menthol cigarette smoking, to discrimination and related to stress, or poor environments. And then we asked them to rate that so we asked them to assess these kinds of things first, then we provided this information and the narratives, and then we reassessed their interest in participating in genetic research in a telephone call. And what we found was that we asked them to rate each of their the narratives on believability, fairness, and whether it was worrisome. And what you see here first is just the bars are just the levels of endorsement of genetic differences between blacks and whites. Modest endorsement of that being believable, 5, but still some range here. Believable, fair, and not particularly worrying. We did the same thing for menthol cigarette smoking and toxin exposure. And again, what you see across the board is, mostly believable and fair and not particularly worrisome. What was associated with increased willingness to participate in genetic research was believability and fairness, and so believability here again, and worry only around menthol cigarettes. So the notion that maybe there's a genetic susceptibility to menthol cigarette smoking, either in taste preferences or in other physiological, might be saying, why is it that this would benefit you differently than the majority population, might be an avenue for increasing willingness. So thinking about our communication strategies and using them in our recruitment approaches. So I think the other parts of this that, from a public health standpoint, those of us who are really connecting to the community, I'm shocked, at least in the social and behavioral science, behavioral medicine, that folks are really not aware of the Egapp Guidelines that were recommended, I think, in 2008, maybe a little later than that, 2010. That basically did a very large evidence-based review to identify Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 genetic applications that were ready for population public health dissemination. And those are really, not surprisingly, the hereditary cancers, and I think familial hypercholesterolemia, I think, is in there as well. So these now say that we should be able to go out into populations, statewide populations, and do brief screeners to identify families who might benefit from genetic counseling and genetic testing. And so that is going to take us into a whole new avenue here, where we're going to be interacting with much more diverse populations. We're working through state health departments and so forth, where they're going to have lower health literacy, lower genetic literacy. They're also, with breast cancer, these kinds of tests are coming in a climate of very confusing guidelines around mammography screening, for example. No real agreement on when a woman should really start undergoing mammography screening. And so this backdrop of now talking about hereditary breast cancers may be really throw them off. And that really, as we go through this cascade, and I'll show you in a minute, there are going to be big benefits, but they're going to be for a very small fraction of this population. And that's going to leave a whole bunch of other people perhaps maybe experiencing unintended negative consequences that no one really has thought very much about. And we in public health are really well suited to do that. So Georgia has been one of the sort of very vanguard states to actually start a breast cancer screening consortium that is doing hereditary breast cancer screening, genetic counseling, and testing through public health clinics across the state of Georgia. And they're doing this using a website and a 6-item questionnaire, very simple to basically get at the basic parameters of what would suggest a family, an individual and family should be undergoing this genetic counseling. It's ongoing in 13 districts, not counties actually, so there are many more counties. These women are approached in women's health clinics, women between the ages of 25 and 49. Between 2012, when it was launched, in 2013, they screened 2,100 women, but only 3%. That was only 3% of the eligible population base that they were that they're serving. Now, granted, they were predominantly African American, and so taking it out to the public health districts did really amp up recruitment in that regard. But here's where you see a bit of the challenge. So the 2,100 women screened yielded only 130 women who were really needed to be worked up beyond that. And of that, you see this drop off of folks agreeing to do that or not. This all winds down to only 2 women who had, one woman had a BRCA mutation and the other woman had a variant of unknown significance. So this was not a particularly giant effort per se in terms of it was a website 6-question screener done in the women's health clinic, But a lot of women who were touched by that may have come away confused about what that meant. What does inherited cancer mean versus population risk cancer? Those are two different things, and probably many of us in this room don't know that. So we did a pilot study with Emory patients through 3 different clinic settings at Emory and through this Georgia Department of Public Health. Among the women who were found to be negative, so these are women that would not be referred for screening, and found that there was pretty low recall of the results. So I guess that's kind of a good thing since it didn't have implications for them necessarily. But really few of these women were accurate in understanding what that BRCA, of those who did recall it, the 50% who did recall it, were very poor accuracy in terms of what that meant for inherited cancer risk, for carrying a BRCA mutation. And even fewer understood what it meant in terms of you're still at average risk for breast cancer. So you should do nothing different in terms of your mammography screening than you were doing before. They did not understand that. So we have an inadvertent potential of taking that 95% of women that are screen negative and leaving them thinking that they're not at risk for cancer, breast cancer, or they're at lower risk for breast cancer. So you put this up against also these sort of consumer large national events of the Angelina Jolie and the sense that the population doesn't really understand it. All the press coverage of this was criticized for not really doing anything to emphasize the fact that this was a rare occurrence, that these are rare mutations, and so raising unnecessarily quite a few publications saying it sort of had raised women's already inflated sense that breast cancer is going to be the leading cause of death when we know it's heart disease. But what we found is that the more interaction that the women had, the more media exposure that they suggested, that actually that raised their confidence, that they really understood what this all meant. Artificially raised their confidence because their genetic literacy scores were low, and for those individuals, more media exposure, they had more confidence. And it was confidence that made them favor mastectomies. And what we know from looking at surgeon data is that there's probably a lot of unnecessary mastectomies occurring because women are not getting proper advice about what these different mutations mean and what other alternatives are. So again, this is all taking place in a larger context. All right. Couple of things in terms of, I'm going to go through these a little faster because I do want to leave us some time to talk. I think the major message here is that there's this, if we're going to take these genetic counseling tools out into the public in a broader way, in a population level way, we need to do a lot more thinking about genetic counseling itself. And Galen Joseph at University of San Francisco has done some really deep looks at by observing genetic counseling sessions in public health clinics, understanding what the mismatches between what genetic counselors are telling patients and what patients want to hear. And I can just summarize for you here that the mismatches is that genetic counselors are giving too much information, complex terminology, information is not perceived to be relevant, and so forth. And that mismatch is also, again, could put us in a situation of unintended negative consequences. They then took these findings and made a more appropriate for low literacy genetic counseling protocol and tested it with a call-in line to a breast and cervical cancer hotline. So this was to women who were uninsured. And what they found is that they had a dramatic effect on the probability of not being counseled. So more women got counseled. It's a little opposite what you would think in the survival curve. And this was a delayed intervention. So that these kinds of things of really understanding literacy and taking that into account can make a big difference as we think about population dissemination. And again, it's not just the individual, it's the whole family. Very little research looking at the whole family and family communication. And what we know, very little that we know, is that different members of the family play different roles in communication. Women tend to be gatherers, especially second generation women, grandmothers, parents tend to be gatherers of information. Sisters and cousins tend to be disseminators of information among women who have breast cancer. And so how do we take advantage of that in terms of our public health interventions? Not explored at all. What we know also from like HINTS data, this is a nationally representative cancer survey, is that actually the public doesn't really trust their family members. They don't trust their family members to give them health information. They don't ask their family members for health advice. So we've got a long way to go if we're really going to try to get family history taking to occur. They don't think family history is particularly important. So again, from a public health standpoint, we pay very little attention to family history. And that this is not a point in time. We treat genetic counseling like it's a one moment in time. And what we know is that it isn't. That for many of these women, if you think about women being screened at 25 years old, they are very young, and they're going to have to live with this information for their whole life. And we don't pay any attention to the life course perspective on that and how that plays out. And just in linking that to chemo prevention adherence, what we see, and these are large samples, is 100,000 women through Northwestern's electronic health records, is that young women, premenopausal women, there's no racial ethnic differences in adherence. It's not complete, but you can see here whites, blacks, Hispanics, and Asians pretty even. And the reason for that is that these women are young, and fertility concerns are the driver, and tamoxifen interferes. It puts women into early menopause. So it's not a racial issue, it's a I want to have a family issue. Whereas when you get postmenopausal and you start to see that the kinds of things that we normally see, things like net worth and race in combination, are what are impairing adherence. And we know that. We know that most of us who do this kind of work in public health know this from chronic disease management. These are the same kinds of patterns that we see in chronic disease management. So, closing. I hope that I'm leaving you with the sense that the patient is more than a tumor. I think that where the social and behavioral sciences fit in here is that there's the social ecological model, there's epigenetics that we're learning more about and that we could be bringing in, that there's influences at all levels, both influences in how science is done and influences in the populations that we're interested in. And I'm going to just close by saying I think what we could be doing here in terms of social and behavioral science is also thinking more about helping with novel measures and subjective measures being often bigger predictors of some of our health outcomes than objective measures, particularly of environment. And so we have these new kinds of measures that are happening. I love the convoys of social support, which combines social networks with lifespan development, and that maybe it's the convoys of social support that you had when you were a young adult that are really were the most important in terms of driving current health outcomes and changes in those networks over time. So focus now going forward, and maybe some time to chat about this, is really if we want to collaborate, I think it's this issue of reach of precision medicine, precision public health, whatever you want to call it. That we have to really think about uptake, both from a research and a clinical practice standpoint among individuals and families. We have to start moving outside the bounds of clinical settings, get into the public health arena, which has a boatload of challenges. Communication is at the heart of all of it. So partnering also with our communication colleagues, and then thinking more in terms of survivorship and life course. And I think just doing those things would position this group ahead of most in the country. And that I think there's lots of portals for these kinds of collaborations. But most importantly, there needs to be incentives at the leadership level. So there needs to be either opportunities to have formative discussions, not in a fire drill mode when an RFA comes out, but way in advance of that, to really shape this science and be leaders in the field. And I think pilot funds, anything that leadership can do to create these opportunities. And I think at heart it needs to be fun, and it needs to be exciting, and all the scientists that are at the table, at the banquet, so to speak, should be seeing value for their perspective and for their field of science. So thank you. Yes, questions? Yeah?
So, I'm going to ask your opinion on something. So when you started out talking about the inability or the lack of success in recruiting diverse populations, a lot of those projects were top-down mandated. And let me give an example of one that wasn't so much of the Southern Community Cohort Study, which has 85,000 people in the Southwest, 2/3 African American, for cancer, and they're now in their like 15th or 16th year. So that wasn't mandated from above. Is there
Isn't
a
that
reason
cool?
that mandate from above works more poorly? Is there a downward communication that it's apparent that that's what's happening?
I think that's a really good question. And I think it's interesting to me that when something like All of Us was being initiated, that they wouldn't have looked at that kind of a successful, because when you can see, if you look at CGN and you look at All of Us, they're pretty much the same.
Well, National Children's Study was the other one which got...
Yeah, did the same thing. Yeah.
You know, and I'm concerned that those kinds of programs, and I'm not a fan of All of Us,
Yeah, yeah.
you know, really are doomed to failure from day one because they don't actually incorporate the kinds of thought processes that are necessary.
Yeah, I agree.
They're engineered from the top down, and that doesn't necessarily work.
Yeah. I would totally agree. Yeah.
We have made the observation here in Cleveland that there are big disparities in who has access to high-speed internet, and we know nationally, even though everybody and its mother has a smartphone, there are big disparities in who has data plans and the skills to use those. As communications and recruitment for research and patient-generated outcomes moves online, I have a big concern that that's going to further fuel these disparities. Do you see any attention being paid to these issues anywhere?
Well, I think there's certainly funding to look at disparities, and I think there are certainly ways that you could be proposing these kinds of research questions about, given these distinct barriers. I mean, certainly in dissemination and implementation, some of this is falling into that rubric. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's why I present data like the data from Georgetown, which is showing that even if you can reach them with these electronic devices, they may not respond as well to it. I think those are the kinds of preliminary data that you need to bring along with a research question and do an investigator-initiated, this is what we want to do. ELSI right now, or the Genome, has funding, an RFA out on that. I think that those kinds of questions would fall under. So, yeah, I think it's just you have to pose the question, but you have to have the research imagination to do that. And I do think, these funders right now in the genomics world, this is why the collaboration is so important. They're so fixated on the technology. And so I think the research recruitment aspects of this is probably a nice way to blend those needs and bring, other disciplines into it as well. So, yeah.
So, how much of a gap do you think there is between the development of the science and then the ability to communicate the science and the treatment associated with it? And do you think that gap is going to accelerate or sort of stay the same? And what are the implications of that?
I think you're seeing now, if you look in the literature, you're seeing, especially in the area of genetics, folks like Muin Corey are starting to, and Wiley Burke, I think, has a model as well, where it's more of a circular, where they're recognizing that all of this work, so there's cross bands across the sort of T1, T5, so it's not T1 here and T5 out here, it's a circle with T1 informing T5 right now, and this more of this spokes in a wheel kind of model. So I think there's definitely recognition of that. I think it's really crafting these kind of appropriately respectful of the science, not being nihilistic about the science, but at the same time bringing the data to be critical of it and say this is kind of what we need to do it sooner. But I don't know if that was very helpful, but yeah, I think there is movement towards recognizing that it shouldn't be operating that way. Yeah.
Colleen, thank you for your presentation, and so I appreciated throughout your entire talk you used disparity and difference.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something that a lot of people struggle with. I myself don't even have a question form yet to ask you, but it's more about, do you see greater discussion about how to disseminate that information that there is a difference And then there is disparity to the geneticists and other people at NIH really to hone in that we need to focus on disparities, and yes, we can also look at differences. Just more about a greater conversation at the national level.
Well, differences, I think both of them are very important. I mean, I think when we think about D&I, disseminated implementation, differences are very, very important. I mean, reach is about disparity perhaps, but also about difference. But so I think, I'm not saying that one is more important than the other. I think they're both really important. I just think it's really important to recognize the difference. Because when we first started seeing that African American women were not taking up BRCA testing, there was a lot of debate in the literature about whether that was, I mean, so what, is there a right answer? I mean, and when you see where the science base takes you, no, there isn't a right answer. This isn't, the outcome here is informed decision making. Did this person make a decision that was consistent with their values and their knowledge, and was that a consistent decision? And there's measures of that. It wasn't that 80% did it in the African American community, you know, or 40% did it in the African American community, and 80% did it in the, that wasn't what was important. But understanding that difference could inform an intervention, a decision-making intervention that would be helpful to African American women, so you made sure that they were making an informed decision. So it's just, I think, separating out the two would help me get clearer on the research question I'm going to ask and what I'm going to do with that. But I'm also making the point that it's complicated because some of the differences are a result of disparities at the higher end of the science cascade. Yeah.
Thank you. This was really wonderful.
Yeah.
So for our group, you have a sort of a sense of our own in the diversity here. What your presentation also highlights to me is that we have very different endpoints and interests. And so to come up with a research question that has a common endpoint may be our biggest challenge. Because the one where you showed the public health clinics, that's the one that strikes me the most, because that's sort of where I go thinking, okay, we could engage in all this, but if that's the end result, that's not a good use of our energy. And so it's that place of like, what's the end result?
Well, let me clarify though. Yes, in that case, two women were identified. Now their networks, those two women might yield an incredible network of families that would also benefit. But when you think about it from the clinical perspective and the numbers of women that are being gone through to get that, it may be that you test out sort of screening differently so that you're not, you know, imposing as much on the 95% or 92% that aren't in the high risk group. You know, that's again a research question. How do you do that in a public health domain? Because there really is great benefit to the few, and those maybe 20% are using 80% of the resources, or that woman, those two women might have lost, you know, 30, 40, 50 years of life years. So but I think that's kind of the interesting public debate that we're not having, which again is what community-based participatory research could do for us.
I think it's the notion of also the resources that go into doing a large-scale public health initiative like that. And then like we talked last night, but that money could be applied to reducing social determinants, which could also affect maybe even a higher number of people. So that's the bigger, I think that's the question. So, you know, for our group, like, what are some of these common spaces?
Well, I would push back again on that, because I am in this space, and I am doing this, and I am a public health researcher, and I think that what's the opportunity? I mean, some of this, you know, when you see Angelina Jolie and other high-profile folks that are out there, and women have inflated perceptions of their risk, this sort of genetic screening or family history screening could be useful. Family history isn't just about breast cancer. We could be doing family histories with our clinical folks in these settings on a wide range. There's many public health family history tools that are underutilized. And we could be using, that may be attractive to people to come into programs because they're seeing all this note that, you know, genetics is on the radar screen. So we might be bringing people in that we wouldn't normally touch because of these screening tools. But we don't want to miss the opportunity for the 92% and make sure that, you know, they're not going away misunderstanding their screening need. Maybe it's even an opportunity to reinforce their screening need. So you don't just screen them and throw them away, which right now is what's happening because there's no public health people at the table. They're just focused on the 2 or 5 or 8% that are the high-risk group. But we could do it differently, is what I'm saying, if we were engaged. Yeah.
I could point out, this is simply the prevention paradox, that you have to intervene with many to benefit a few. And recognizing that it applies to genomics in their contribution to public health is no different than everybody not being able to have large drinks in order to benefit those who are most likely to be affected.
Yeah.
So I think the application can be across the different fields.
Yeah, I think it's the thinking about it from the perspective that you're bringing is what is the benefit to the lion's share? How do we use that as an opportunity to promote other things that maybe are getting misunderstood? And are there other ways to target that would enable us to get a bigger bang for the buck out of this too? So I think there's plenty of questions. I wouldn't dismiss it because of the 2. But it is an important dilemma, I think, to think about. Yeah.
So in your Georgia experience, the BRST study, you mentioned the Emory and Georgia Department of Health collaboration partnership. What kind of role that plays in this study? I was curious about.
What kind of role does? I'm sorry.
The Department of Public Health.
So this was the BRIST program in the Department of Public Health was initially funded by the CDC. They funded several states. They funded Michigan, Georgia, and a couple others. Michigan's the only state that's continuing, and that's HNPCC. But Georgia has continued to do it in their public health clinics. Emory was a separate study. We just had the opportunity to see if we had a large number of women who were being told they were not in the high-risk group, and so we took the opportunity to test out, were they understanding what that meant, and then we just supplemented that with a smaller sample, like 30 women from the Georgia Department of Health. This was preliminary data for a grant that we submitted. And so Emory wasn't really involved, other than it was an Emory professor who developed the screening tool and validated the screening tool.
The fund went to the Department.
The funding went to the Public Health Department. Yep. And now they've been doing it on like their state license plates, revenue. They've been doing it on basically continuing the program, but it's very, very low resourced. So it's kind of incidental in when it's being applied in the clinics. And that's why the 3% reach. And our grant was to try to increase reach and take into account the fact that the lion's share we're not going to have and promote smoking cessation and breast cancer screening and all those other things at the time that we were also doing the risk assessment.
Take
Yeah.
one more question.
Okay.
So in the space of genomics, you're talking about genetic and genomic translation, and I know that over the last 5 to 10 years, particularly in diagnostics, which moves faster than anything else, a lot of the translation no longer looks like the T1 through T5 that maybe it ever did. It now is happening largely in the clinical space. You take a sort of a beta form of a test and you launch it clinically and you use that clinical income to then validate it, expand it, and this happens, of course, because we have this big laboratory developed testing loophole that the FDA doesn't oversee. And in that context of rapid translation that's not in the research space, that's in the clinical space, it's already impacting people's health. What do you see as any alterations in the role of social and behavioral science to impact that and to help it translate in ways that are socially appropriate and ethically appropriate?
Well, I think that's pretty much the same as 23andMe, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's in the
And I
public.
work a lot in the prenatal space, so the cell-free DNA testing has been a big
Yeah.
impact of that,
Yeah.
and now liquid biopsy in the cancer
Yeah.
space is an outgrowth of that.
Yeah. I think you can still do research on it. I mean, it's sort of the whole issue of de-implementation, it's sort of like we have lots of things in clinical space that really there's no evidence base to support it, but it's
Yeah.
become standard practice and you just do it. And the whole question becomes bringing evidence base to that to de-implement it if necessary. And so you might not frame it that way because that might not make you popular, but I think it doesn't preclude you from doing these kinds of, asking these kinds of research questions within that domain post implementation. I think a lot of folks are doing 23. Now 23andMe is going to be, you know, I mean, it's been offering BRCA all along, but then it got shut down for a while. Now it's back up again. And, you know, there's lots of debate about that. And I could debate either side, and especially from a reach standpoint. So, this is, you know, public having this knowledge should be up to them if they want to have it. Or, on the other hand, it could do a lot of harm. So those are legitimate research questions.
What is knowledge? I mean, we know that 40% of their BRCA results are not accurate. So, I mean, is that really knowledge at all?
Right.
So,
right.
And that same thing happens in other genetic diagnostics.
Yeah. But I think that's where you bring this whatever science to that post hoc, and you make the case that that's an important unanswered question. That these, you know, you make the case this is into practice. Before the evidence base to support it. Now you're going to collect some. I mean, I think that's perfectly reasonable. Yeah. Is that it? Are we? I'm sorry. I hoped we'd get a little discussion about incentives, but maybe we can do. Maybe this will be the spark for you to make these groups happen, to sort of have these discussions, because you're really this is a really diverse, really good group to be doing this. I mean, I've learned that in this short day and a half. So, yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah.